In ethical culture, that's this. We have a lot to do, clearly. There are a lot of ways to grow. We support each other through the ups and downs of our lives. But at this moment in history, we are called to confront systemic racism.
Come on.
This is not easy. Just ask some of our friends of color in this room who have been doing it all their lives. For those of you, this is for you. Thank you for being my teachers. Another teacher, Michael Eric Dyson, used to say that in church, if the sermon ain't making you a little bit uncomfortable, it ain't effective.
Yes, come on today.
In his book, Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America, Dyson explains, if it doesn't cost you anything, you're not really engaging in change.
That's right.
You're engaging in convenience.
Yeah.
You're engaging in the overflow. Ooh. At our best, ethical culture can do better than that. We are all at different points of this journey, but we have this in common, and that is we have much more work to do.
Yes.
As individuals, as ethical societies, and as a nation. And I suggest that most of us who identify as white, as I do, have the most work to do. For people of color, the wounds of racism are painful, often fatal. But racism has infected us all and wounded us all, psychologically and ethically, in manners profound and subtle and obvious and mundane. And we have to transform those wounds into corrective action and redemption. For this transformation to reflect ethical culture values, it must be grounded on loving, candid, respectful, ethical relationships. We know that. This is the heart of ethical culture, after all. Anti-racism work, for us, the salvation is in the relationships. But for this transformation to be effective, it must involve working for transformation simultaneously, internally, institutionally, and nationally. You can't wait for one to do the others.
Come on.
On the personal level, the work I have to do to transform my personal petty suffering to help me do my anti-racism work is pretty simple for me. I use the term petty to describe the wound I have due to racism intentionally. I don't mean to be dismissive. I don't mean to be dramatic. Despite my comfortable life, the pain is real, as it is for many who lead a comfortable life. But I use the term petty as a relative term. My suffering is obviously petty compared to 400 years of suffering endured by enslaved Africans and their descendants and people of color who suffer from racism. I'm not going to go into the multiple and nefarious ways racism continues to wound and kill people of color. You can read Randall Robinson, Michelle Alexander, or talk to a number of people in this room. But transformation began for me growing up on a college campus during the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was a hero of mine who epitomized Cornell West's reminder that justice is what love looks like in public.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
So I developed a deep, though naive, yearning to end racism. In my adolescent imagination, I was walking right alongside the icons of the movement, as some of you did in reality. But in this little imaginary experiment, it helped transform the fear and the anger and the ugliness of racism into a righteous indignation. I didn't want to be part of the problem. I wanted to be part of the solution. The day after King was shot, that solution seemed a lot further away. My fifth grade teacher gathered us together for something of a public service announcement. She said, "Be careful going home and over the weekend because the black children are angry. They might take it out on you. Watch where you go in the city." I was confused, sad, scared. My confusion grew only more when in 1969 we moved to Berkeley, California, and I attended 7th grade at Martin Luther King Jr. High School, just renamed in honor of the slain moral leader. There, the color of my skin and the correct assumption of my privilege made me a target. So I was threatened a couple of times, beat up a couple of times. and I felt paralyzed, unable to process it then. I'm not going to go into the details of the inner work that I've done as an adult to try to process those childhood fears and anger. You can do that work, but too often whites get caught up in trying to prove to each other who is more wounded, right? Or maybe trying to prove that you are more multicultural than that.
So,
Do the inner work, but connect the inner work to the outer work. You can't retreat and do it alone. And I connected the inner work with my work in studying history. Because history frames our current work. In the words of John Hope Franklin, we must confront our past and see it for what it is. One reviewer said of Franklin, he saw that the past is, not the past was. The past lives on only if we understand and acknowledge this past we grapple with and the conflicts of the present and the promise of the future. End quote. So in this context of historical suffering, my own subjective discomfort began to paralyze me less. Because I learned from the context of slave narratives, historical analysis, and stories from people, many in this room, who have been victimized by racism. I learned by stories from Dan Smith, a member of the Washington Ethical Society, whose father was born a slave. Let me repeat that. Whose father was born in slavery. It wasn't that long ago. Don't let him tell you that. Dan shared with my students in my school how racial injustice lives on today, literally embodied in him as it is embodied in many people in this room.
yes, it is.
He taught me that racism wasn't just my problem. It's historical, it's institutional, it's systemic, and it's my problem. So that scared little boy in me began to grow up because of those stories. The personal is the political.
Right.
Inner work supports outer work. I hope it helps me in my work in ethical culture. So let me talk about the institutional transformation we need. When I ask the question, how can generally majority white communities, which happens to be ethical societies, do authentic, respectful, and effective racial justice work? Recently, I wondered if that was the right question to ask. In contemplating the next step in anti-racism work for dominantly majority white communities, perhaps the answer that I was looking for is stop being dominantly majority white communities. Might we ask not about what we do, but who we are? This existentially institutional question is challenging, I know. Most ethical societies are wrestling with this question in the context of their own strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. You know that. We make mistakes all the time. We may forget to assure diverse voices on our boards, or on our platform programs, or at our assembly programs. But for those of us who are lucky enough to live in relatively diverse areas of the world, we can begin by just opening our doors and cultivating inclusive organizational cultures. Some ethical societies are doing this organic transformation. What can happen when an ethical society near diverse populations truly reflects their community? It changes them. And change is scary. We know that. It can evoke a sense of loss, a loss of the familiar, a loss of unquestioned assumptions, a loss of the ability to ignore the ugliness of racism and the work that it calls us to do. Because no longer are racial issues out there. They're in our communities. And once they're in our communities, they're in our hearts. Transforming our societies brings the discussion into our community. And one small step of transforming one of our societies was when the board of the Philadelphia Ethical Society voted to put up a Black Lives Matter banner on their windows. It's, by itself, very modest. But it reminds us why we organized and fund Camp Linden that serves primarily inner-city children of color. It reminds us why we joined POWER, People Organized to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild, our interfaith organization, which focuses on issues of concern to communities of color in Philadelphia. It reminds why we formed a task force on creative systemic racism. It reminds us why we host racial justice discussion groups, workshops, talks, art installations. And most importantly, it reminds us of how much more work we have to do. At the Baltimore Society, we're reminded of the work we have to do every day just looking at the local paper. Every day. We're reminded of the death of Freddie Gray, just a mile or two from here in Sandtown. He didn't die from just one fall in a police van. He died because of the economic and social burdens that are simply dumped on communities of color yesterday. It's not just about individuals. It's about the system. And it's about us. The Baltimore Ethical Society was so moved by the work that the Raise Your Voice kids were doing, the Elliott Black winners. How many were at the dinner last night? This group of kids were fed up of toxins being thrown into their neighborhoods. And as was mentioned by our speaker Saturday morning, Freddie Gray, according to the Baltimore Sun, may have struggled in school and fall into being a target of the police because of the lead poisoning that had infected his body, moving from one lead-infected rental apartment to another in Baltimore. Experts say that his impairment might have been severe. You wonder how many more people have been so harmed. On top of environmental issues, many neighborhoods suffer, cuts from school funding, after-school programs, unequal housing opportunities, lack of jobs, educational disparities, housing, etc. And this led us to join BUILD, Baltimore's United in Leadership Development. That's our local industrial area foundation group. One of the reasons why we joined that group was because we're too small to do it by ourselves. But we also found BUILD's values and their process were similar to our own. BUILD's website says, you'll find us working for change on front stoops and in living rooms and in churches and in classrooms, in City Hall and in the State House. And the secret of the organization's success is its commitment to identify and develop leaders in every community where BUILD works. We don't assume we have the answers at BUILD. We seek common space to share experiences and knowledge about what communities need to heal. Ethical societies can be those spaces too. In particular, because on the BUILD website, they describe the following as their most, quote, radical tactic. It says, our most radical tactic is we meet people face to face and build relationships that help reknit frayed social fabric. We don't seek justice and social change for people. We seek change with people.
Yes.
That's ethical humanism. At our best, ethical culture, like BUILD, embraces what I like to call relational integrity. And for me, integrity implies wholeness. Wholeness of every individual, wholeness of every community, and wholeness of our country. Which brings me to our country. When we seek transformation on how to build racial justice here, we have to know the history and tell the truth. We have to start there. This bizarre juxtaposition of 400 years of democratic idealism and white racial supremacy.
Yeah.
In my very first history course, my professor, Ed Morgan, explained that the interweaving of idealism and brutality was commonplace. He said, the men who came together to found the independent United States dedicated to freedom and equality either held slaves or were willing to join hands with those who did. None of them felt entirely comfortable about the fact, but neither did they feel responsible for it. Most of them had inherited both slaves and their attachment to freedom from an earlier generation, and they knew the two were not unconnected. Ta-Nehisi Coates says it a little bit more succinctly. America begins in black plunder and white democracy, two features that are not contradictory but complementary. So we can't only continue to embrace one half of our national story, we can't only embrace one half of our communities, we can't only embrace one half of ourselves. After the Civil War, those denied equal protection and a fair share of the American pie contributed to our continued power and glory. And to deny this, to intentionally distort the facts, or feign historical amnesia, is bad faith. That's why we passed the resolution this morning to study and move towards reparations in this country. Thank you. In order to transform, we can't wash our hands of the blood. We can wash our hands of denial, evasion, and amnesia.
Yeah.
We can put aside unproductive guilt and get to work. James Baldwin said, "I'm not interested in anybody's guilt. Guilt is a luxury we can no longer afford. I know you didn't do it and I didn't do it either, but I'm responsible for it because I am a man and a citizen of the country, and you are responsible for it too for the very same reason."
My God.
It's not easy work, of course it's not. Racism is ugly, but we can face the ugliness more fully if we work to transform ourselves as individuals and societies. We use our societies to support our individual transformation, and we use ourselves to change our societies.
Come on.
The ugliness that was described by Martin Luther King from behind the bars of the Birmingham jail, scrawled on the edge of a New York Times newspaper, said that the violence that he was accused of stirring up as he moved through the South, he explained it was already there, underneath the surface, described by law and order. Is it described in our ethical societies as what is convenient or what is comfortable?
Unpack it now.
Violence is in the civic body. King said, quote, "like a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness. To the natural medicines of air and light, injustice must be exposed." That's when the work really starts. At times of uncertainty and weakness, many people in this room, myself included, may think we don't have the resources to repair the harm. But how complex and difficult, and how many resources were necessary to create 400 years of systemic oppression based on race? How many resources had to be diverted to enslave our fellow human beings? How many justifications had to be created to make us feel like we could sleep at night? If we can do that for 400 years, we can begin to repair the harm of racism in this country.
That's right.
We cannot retreat from being changed. So to conclude, are we not giving ourselves enough credit as human beings? Can we raise the bar on racial justice? Can we listen and learn from the victims of racism, become more effective accomplices in this work? Can we transform our relationships with racism so we accept responsibility to change the country? Dyson writes, "What I'm talking about is more than recompensations for past injuries, more than a handoff, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is national reckoning that would lead to a spiritual renewal."
Woo!
We are in the position to lead that spiritual renewal, small in number, through loving, candid, ethical, respectful relationships. We can change at all levels, inside ourselves, in our ethical societies, and in the nation. If we can lead a joyous transformation, we can help become more ethical human beings, more inclusive ethical societies, and more racially just country. Thank you very much.